The truck jerked to a stop on the dry dirt road, dust curling in the late afternoon heat. Inside the flatbed, 30 German women, auxiliaries, clerks, nurses, sat stiff as statues, sunburnt and silent, their eyes darting toward the tall silhouettes waiting near the gate. American soldiers leaned against the fence, wide-brimmed Stetsons pulled low, spurs clinking against the gravel. Cowboys, they thought. Cowboys with guns. One woman clenched her teeth, expecting shouts, groping, maybe the snap of a whip. They had heard stories, those stories. And so, when the first soldier stepped forward, she flinched. But instead of violence, he held out a wool blanket, thick, clean, folded neatly in his calloused hands. Another guard tossed a second blanket to a girl shivering beside her. "You'll freeze out here," he said in a southern drawl, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. The women stood dumbfounded. They had braced for cruelty. Instead, the enemy wrapped them in warmth, and nothing made sense anymore. The moment the blankets touched their fingers, the women froze, not in fear, but in disbelief. For weeks, they had moved through a war-torn landscape, shoved from trains to trucks, tramping across burned cities and flattened villages, the very air thick with ash and surrender. Now they were in Texas, or maybe Oklahoma. They hadn't been told. The landscape rolled out like a sepia photograph, flat fields, leaning fences, windmills creaking in the distance. The women stood clustered in the middle of an American POW camp as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Their boots, cracked and mismatched, sank into dry red dirt. Some hadn't eaten properly in days. Their uniforms, once sharp and starched in the Third Reich's bureaucracy, now hung in tatters, hair matted, eyes sunken. One looked at another and muttered, "We are ghosts." They had expected barbed wire and armed men, yes, but they had also expected fists, jeers, humiliation. That was what the Reich had promised. The Americans would strip them, use them, break them. At least, that was what the officers in Berlin had claimed as they handed out cyanide pills and whispered, "Better this than what awaits." Stories had swirled among them like ash, tales of Allied revenge, of women forced into labor until their bodies collapsed, of prisoners beaten for sport. Some whispered worse. These cowboys, though, they didn't leer, they didn't shout. They spoke in low, strange drawls, words like ma'am and blanket and evenin'. One tipped his hat. Another offered a thermos of coffee like it was something sacred. The train ride here had felt like a funeral procession. Through shattered towns, Leipzig, Frankfurt, Metz, their wagons rolled past ruins and rubble. Children stared at them from roadside ditches. Somewhere near the coast, the guards switched, British accents giving way to American twang. And then came the ship. Some had vomited the entire crossing. Others sat silent, staring at the Atlantic, wondering if this journey would end at a prison, a workhouse, or a grave. And now here they were, dust-bitten and dizzy, but alive. One woman, Sabine, a former Luftwaffe radio clerk, stood slightly apart from the group, her eyes fixed on a water tower in the distance. She was not thinking of water, though. She was thinking of her younger brother, 16, maybe 17 now, if he had survived the firebombing of Dresden. She hadn't heard from her family in months. Her last letter had been a desperate plea scribbled in pencil. "Stay alive. Don't believe what they tell you. Just come home." That letter had been folded into the hem of her skirt, hidden like a talisman. She clutched her blanket now as if it might offer answers. It did not. But it was warm, and that confused her more than any bullet ever could. Inside the barracks, the women were met not with cells or chains, but rows of wooden beds, actual beds, with mattresses and pillows. Some were thin and worn, but still more than any of them had expected. Above each bed hung a name card, written carefully in black ink. A few guards had even attempted German spellings with endearing failures. Katharina, written as Katerina, Helga as Helga. One woman laughed, a short, bitter bark, and then clamped her hand over her mouth, horrified by the sound. No one punished her. No one even looked. Dinner was served in a mess hall with windows, real windows, glass intact. Inside, long tables stretched across the room, and from the kitchen rose the smell of something oily, salty, real, potatoes, maybe even bacon. The women hesitated at the door. It could be a trick, but the guards motioned gently, ushering them in as though they were guests, not prisoners. The food was plain, yes, but it was hot, and the bread had crust. One woman whispered, "We're being fattened for slaughter," but she took her tray anyway. Later that night, as dusk turned the sky copper, they heard music. A harmonica, faint and wandering, floated across the camp like a ghost from a different world. No barking dogs, no roll call shouted in rage, just music. Some of the women lay awake, blankets tucked beneath their chins, trying to believe this wasn't a dream. Others could not sleep at all. The blankets were too soft, the air too still, and outside, under the watchtower's shadow, a cowboy leaned against the fence, sipping coffee, tapping his boot to the rhythm of his own tune. The war, it seemed, had paused, for now. But inside every bunk, inside every woman, a different kind of battle had just begun. At dawn, the bell rang with a hollow clang, and the women stirred under their blankets, faces still slack with disbelief. Some rose quickly, driven by habit. Decades of military drills had etched obedience deep into their bones. Others moved slower, as if rising might make the previous day real. Outside, the morning air bit with a dry chill. Dust rolled gently across the packed earth. The mess hall beckoned again, this time with steam rising from its chimney, and the smell, oh God, the smell of bacon drifting out like a siren's call. A woman named Lotta, once a secretary in Hamburg, shuffled forward in line. Her boots were too big, her hair tied with a strip of cloth torn from a hem, but her eyes were alert. She stared at the men serving food, Americans in uniform, yes, but not like the ones in posters. They wore wide-brimmed hats tilted low, canvas jackets half unbuttoned, boots caked with red mud. One chewed a toothpick, another had a piece of straw dangling from his mouth. They looked like characters from a storybook about cowboys and cattle, not the monsters from Nazi pamphlets. When one said, "Mornin', ma'am," she blinked, as if he'd spoken a spell. And then came the tray. Bacon, real bacon, grease still sizzling on a slab of metal, eggs scrambled and steaming, coffee poured black into metal cups. One woman gagged from the smell alone, her stomach too empty to receive it. Another covered her face with trembling hands. Lotta sat across from a woman named Greta, who stared down at her plate as though it were an artifact. "They eat this too," Greta whispered. "I saw them, the guards. They eat this exact food." The words were not a celebration. They were an indictment of everything they'd been made to believe. The coffee was the hardest to accept. It was bitter, scalding, strong, completely unlike the scorched barley substitute they had endured in Germany's last days. One sip burned the roof of Lotta's mouth, but she didn't stop. It was too surreal, too normal. One of the guards, tall, sun-worn, barely in his 20s, walked past the tables, humming what sounded like a country tune. He nodded toward the prisoners, not with pity, not with disdain, but with the kind of casual politeness reserved for customers at a diner. And that, somehow, made it worse. The days began to blend into a rhythm that no one had expected. Wake, eat, work, eat again, sleep. No screaming, no forced confessions. The guards didn't beat them, they didn't leer, they didn't even speak much, except to give instructions or offer casual greetings, always with that maddening civility. One woman said she'd rather be slapped than called ma'am again. At least that would make sense, she muttered. But sense had left them back in the shattered cities, the bombed-out streets, the propaganda halls where maps of Europe glowed red with promises. Here, under Texas skies, the enemy gave them blankets and breakfast. The enemy wore spurs and smelled faintly of tobacco. The enemy listened to radios that played jazz, not marching songs. That realization began to ripple. Quietly, dangerously, in the bunkhouses at night, the women whispered under their blankets. "They're not what we were told. Maybe the stories were wrong. Or maybe we were." It was not a surrender. Not yet. But it was the first crack. Sabine, who once believed death better than dishonor, now found herself waking early just to smell the coffee before the others arrived. She hated herself for it, but she went anyway, and when a cowboy behind the counter smiled and offered her a second cup, she took it, and said thank you, in German. But the word felt like treason in her mouth. That night, as the camp settled into quiet hums and soft shuffling, Lotta sat on the edge of her bunk, the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, eyes locked on the floorboards. Across from her, one of the younger women, Ilse, barely out of girlhood, curled up in her own bed, rocking slightly. The wool blanket she'd been given was clutched to her chest like a lifeline. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Then, without warning, she let out a choking sound, half gasp, half sob, and buried her face into the wool. Her shoulders shook as she wept. She didn't try to hide it. No one moved to comfort her. No one had the strength. Instead, they watched, each from their own corner of the dim barrack, frozen in the recognition of what she was feeling. It wasn't grief. It wasn't relief. It was something worse. Guilt. Not because they were being punished, but because they weren't. The blankets had become symbols of that unbearable contradiction. They were warm. They smelled clean. They had been handed to them without threat, without barter, without even expectation. And that alone made them dangerous. For years they had measured their worth in suffering, hunger, discipline, loyalty to a collapsing empire. But this blanket, this comfort, asked a different question. What if you deserve warmth? No one wanted to answer it. During the day, the women labored quietly, folding laundry, peeling potatoes, hauling buckets of water, but it was at night that the true battles began. In the silence, in the stillness. That was when the old certainties buckled and gave way to doubt. "I don't want to get used to it," someone said from a top bunk one evening. Her voice barely more than a breath. "Used to what?" came another voice from the dark. "To this," the first woman answered, "to the beds, the food, the blankets." It wasn't self-pity, it was fear. Because to accept this comfort was to admit the enemy wasn't cruel. And if the enemy wasn't cruel, then everything they'd been told, everything they had clung to, might be a lie. And what then had all the deaths been for? Sabine listened from her cot. Her own blanket was pulled to her chin, hands clutching the edges like armor. She remembered sleeping in basements during the raids on Berlin, remembered the cold of concrete under her ribs, the way her mother would lay her own coat over Sabine's shoulders while shivering herself. She hadn't thought of that in months, but now, wrapped in American wool, the memory flooded back, and with it, a sense of betrayal so strong she nearly tore the blanket from her body. She didn't. She couldn't. Later, at the mess hall, the whispers turned sharper, the confusion starting to sound like suspicion. "Do you think this is the punishment?" one woman asked. "What are you talking about?" someone replied. "This softness," she said. "The food, the kindness. Maybe this is how they break us." It sounded absurd, but no one laughed. The thought lingered, because there was something disorienting in the civility. It unmoored them. No commands barked, no violence, just a slow, gnawing erosion of everything they had braced for. The enemy's worst weapon, it turned out, wasn't cruelty. It was mercy. Ilse, the one who had wept into her blanket, spoke again that night. Her voice was small, uncertain, like someone afraid to be heard. "My brother starved in the streets of Leipzig. I watched him die. And here they feed us." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one had a response, because they all knew the truth of it. Somewhere in the ruins of Germany their families were scavenging for bark and bones, and yet they, prisoners, were warm, full, alive. In America, at the hands of cowboys. Lotta rolled over in her bunk, burying her face in the pillow. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear the blanket away, to feel the cold, to remind herself that she was still part of the suffering. But what haunted her more than shame was the question she could no longer silence. If the enemy saw them as human, then why hadn't their own country? The question lingered in the cold dawn air like smoke, invisible but choking. Days passed. The routine deepened. Morning roll call, coffee, work detail, dinner, silence. And then, one afternoon, just after a dry wind swept the camp's main road clean of dust, the guards brought something unexpected: pencils, paper, and a wooden crate used as a desk. A soldier, barely older than the women themselves, stood beside it holding a clipboard and a list. "You can write home," he said in a slow, deliberate voice. "1 page. Letters will be inspected." Then he stepped back, letting the crate stand like a monument in the yard. The women stared at the paper as if it were a trap. At first, no one moved. Then a few crept forward, hesitant, like deer approaching water. Lotta watched from the shade of the laundry shed. Her hands ached from wringing uniforms, but it was her chest that tightened as the pages passed from one woman to another. Eventually, she stood and joined the line. When the pencil touched her fingers, she felt something snap inside her. Not pain exactly, but pressure, long held, suddenly released. She sat cross-legged in the dust and began to write. "Dear Marta," she scrawled, "I am somewhere in America. I sleep indoors. I am fed. I do not understand." The pencil wobbled slightly in her grip. She hesitated, then added, "The guards speak gently. We are not mistreated. It is strange." She stared at the half-finished page, her eyes burning. What else could she say? That the Americans served them potatoes and eggs? That they called her ma'am when handing her laundry soap? That one of them had offered her a flower yesterday, picked from the edge of the camp fence? She could barely believe it herself. So she wrote the truth that made no sense. "I thought I would be punished. Instead, they gave me a blanket." Others wrote as well, their letters scattered like fallen leaves across the dirt. Some were meticulous, others shaking with emotion. A few scratched out whole paragraphs only to start over again. Ilse, still clutching her blanket like a shield, wrote slowly, pausing often. When Sabine walked past, she glanced down and saw the words, "I'm alive, Mama. That is all. I am alive." Her hand tightened reflexively on her own pencil, but with the letters came fear. What if their words were intercepted? What if the Americans read them first, or worse, the censors in Germany? What would their families think, receiving letters that hinted at comfort, even safety? Could they possibly understand, or would they spit at the sight of such betrayal? One woman, a former nurse named Hedwig, tore up her letter before she finished. "I can't," she muttered, stuffing the pieces into her pocket. "They're starving, and I'm writing about bread." She couldn't bring herself to describe the stew, the clean floors, the hot showers. It felt obscene. But others kept writing, not because they wanted to boast or confess, but because they had no one else to tell. In the days that followed, more pages appeared, smuggled scraps folded beneath pillows, hidden under mattresses, tucked into boots. Some wrote for themselves, not to send, just to make sense of what was happening. The words became a salve for the ache that had no name. But beneath every line was the same realization. The world they had left no longer fit the story they now lived. Inside the fences, they were fed, clothed, spoken to with respect. Outside, in what remained of Germany, families boiled weeds to survive, and still they could not find the language for this reversal. So they scribbled what they could, sealed the pages with trembling hands, and dropped them into the collection box like confessions into a fire. None of them knew what would reach home or what would be believed, but for the first time since the surrender, they had written in their own voices, not for a commander, not for a nation, for themselves. The order came quietly, almost too casually. Just after midday, when the sun had begun to bake the dirt roads into cracking lines, the guards told the women to gather by the eastern barrack. There was no explanation, only gestures. "This way." The women exchanged glances as they fell into line, the familiar clutch of unease returning to their bellies. A new kind of silence descended, one thick with memory. Ilse stepped in beside Sabine and whispered, "This is where they break us." No one argued. No one reassured her. They had all heard rumors. Showers that were not really showers, tiled rooms that never let anyone out. The stories came from other fronts, other camps, whispers soaked in fear. And now, lined up outside a squat concrete building with metal doors and no windows, those stories returned like ghosts. As they were ushered inside, the tension rose, but what greeted them was not horror. It was steam. Warm, fragrant air enveloped them, curling around their cheeks and collarbones. The building smelled faintly of something impossible. Flowers, not real ones, but soap. Real soap. Heavy white bars were stacked beside folded towels and plain cotton clothes. The women paused at the entrance, stunned into stillness. One of the guards, seeing their hesitation, stepped forward and pointed. "Wash," he said simply. Then he turned his back and walked away. Some of the women remained frozen, afraid to undress. They clung to their worn uniforms like they were armor, like the fabric itself would protect them from humiliation. But eventually, slowly, clothes came off. One woman began to sob before the water even touched her skin. Another stood under the stream fully dressed, as if unwilling to believe it was safe. But then the water came, hot, clean, relentless. And something in them unraveled. Sabine stepped into one of the stalls and felt the warmth hit her spine, traveling down in rivulets that washed away weeks of sweat, grime, and fear. The bar of soap shook in her hand as she raised it to her collarbone. She hadn't used real soap in years, not since the early days of the war, before rationing, before the slow collapse of everything. She lathered her arms, her neck, her scalp. The smell of lavender, or something like it, rose around her like mist. She watched gray water swirl down the drain and felt her knees buckle. Around her, the sound of water mixed with soft weeping. No one spoke. Words would have shattered the moment. The steam blurred the walls, blurred their memories. In that room, for those brief minutes, they were not prisoners. They were not enemies. They were women, aching, broken, but clean. When they stepped out, wrapped in warm towels, some laughed quietly, not from joy, but disbelief. A woman named Herta looked down at her hands and whispered, "I forgot what my skin looked like." Another reached for her hair, now free of knots, and ran her fingers through it again and again, as though unsure it was real. Later in the bunkhouse the change lingered. The scent of soap clung to the beds. The women walked a little differently, moved a little slower, as if some invisible burden had been lifted. Sabine sat on her bunk with a pencil and wrote in the corner of her journal, "Today I wept while washing, not from pain, from memory. I have never felt so human." She tucked the journal under her mattress and pulled the new cotton shirt over her shoulders. The world outside the camp still burned, families still starved. But for a few brief minutes, in a shower built by the enemy, something had returned that war had tried to erase: dignity. And in its place came something more dangerous than hate: the beginning of healing. Soon after the day of soap, camp life settled into something resembling rhythm. Not normal, exactly. Normal had long since ceased to exist, but stable. Each woman was assigned a duty. Lotta was placed in the laundry, where steam rose from the basins and the scent of starch hung thick in the air. Ilse worked in the gardens, her fingers calloused from pruning sunflowers and scrubbing dirt from carrots. Sabine was given a post in the camp kitchen. She stirred vats of porridge with a wooden paddle taller than she was, sweat beading on her forehead, the smell of cinnamon and boiled oats clinging to her sleeves. They labored because they were told to, yes, but also because it gave the days shape. And in a place defined by absence, of freedom, of family, of everything once known, structure was a strange kind of salvation. The shock came not from the work, but what followed it. At the end of each week the women were paid, not in dollars, not in gold, but in thin pastel slips of camp script, small paper notes that could be exchanged at the canteen. Most had assumed it was meaningless, another psychological game. But then one woman returned from the canteen clutching a bar of chocolate, her eyes wide. Another bought a comb. A third held up a tube of lipstick like it was a relic from another life. There were cigarettes, notebooks, pencils, even thread. Hedwig, always the skeptic, picked up a tin of fruit and turned it over in her hands for hours before eating it. It was sweet. She cried, but with each small indulgence came a tightening of the chest. The chocolate tasted like something stolen. The lipstick felt like a sin. Because the letters from home, when they arrived, told a different story. Bombed-out apartments, children with distended bellies, mothers boiling bark for soup. In Munich, women were rumored to fight over moldy bread crusts. In Dresden, whole districts were gone. One letter, passed between 5 hands before being hidden under a mattress, read, "We have burned the last of the furniture. We sleep on the floor. Father has not returned. We fear he never will." Sabine read that one in silence, then tucked it beneath her shirt. That afternoon she refused her portion of stew. The tension grew quiet but sharp. In the evenings, as they sat beneath the hanging bulbs in the barracks or lingered outside under the foreign constellations, the conversations turned inward. Some women hoarded their script, refusing to visit the canteen. Others bought chocolates but didn't eat them, storing them in drawers as if to remind themselves that hunger could still exist even when their stomachs were full. Ilse, watching Sabine nibble a square of milk chocolate one evening, asked, "Does it taste like guilt?" Sabine didn't answer. She didn't need to. Arguments began in whispers. "We didn't ask for this," someone would say. "We're still prisoners." But the retort came swiftly. "Are we?" They wore clean clothes, they had beds, they had food, and now they had money. One woman muttered, "This isn't captivity, this is embarrassment." Another shot back, "Would you rather be digging graves outside Berlin?" The shame didn't come from mistreatment, it came from being treated too well. That night, Lotta sat cross-legged on her bunk and wrote a single line in her journal. "Is survival a betrayal?" The words stared back at her. She tried to cross them out. She couldn't, because deep down they all feared the same thing, that the price of surviving with comfort was carrying a truth no one back home would want to hear, and maybe, even worse, a truth they themselves didn't yet know how to live with. It began with a chalkboard. A rectangle of scuffed black wood was mounted one morning in the corner of the mess hall, its surface already smeared with chalk dust. The guards moved the benches inward, stacking them like school rows, and when the women were ushered in, there it was, written in large white strokes across the top: freedom. No explanation, no warning, just that one word hanging like smoke in the air. Sabine stared at it, unmoving. It felt like a taunt. Ilse whispered from the bench beside her, "They're trying to re-educate us." A few of the women muttered the word Umerziehung, re-education, a thing they had once associated with defectors, not themselves. A young American corporal, barely more than a boy, stepped in front of the board, cleared his throat, and began pointing to the letters. F-R-E. His accent was strange, almost musical. Then he grinned and said, "Repeat." Some did. Others crossed their arms or stared straight ahead, defiantly silent. But as the lessons stretched on, basic phrases, names for objects around the room, simple greetings, the resistance softened. There was no punishment for refusing, no reward for participation, just repetition. And repetition, in time, became rhythm. Still, it wasn't until the films arrived that the silence truly broke. One evening, instead of the usual supper bell, the guards wheeled in a projector. A white bedsheet was strung along the back wall, the light flickering against it in pale waves. The women shuffled into the mess hall uncertainly, trays set aside, conversations hushed. They expected American propaganda, maybe some crude cartoon mocking the Reich. What they got instead was horror. The film opened with the gates of Buchenwald. Then came the bodies, stacked like cordwood, hollow eyes, bones dressed in skin, Allied soldiers walking slowly through the camps, pressing handkerchiefs to their mouths, footage of ovens, a girl in striped pajamas, so thin her limbs looked carved from twigs. The camera did not flinch. It lingered. It made them look. By the third reel, several women had turned away. One had left the room entirely. Sabine sat still as stone. Her breath came shallow, but her eyes did not move. Ilse gripped her own arm, as if trying to stop herself from shaking. Lotta, sitting near the back, whispered into her sleeve, "Was all of it true?" No one answered, because something had cracked open in that moment, not just a silence, but a belief. The women had grown up in a system that demanded loyalty above all, that punished curiosity, that painted the Reich as a shield against barbarism. But now, projected onto a sheet in a dining hall built by their enemies, was something none of them had been prepared to see: the evidence. The Americans did not shout or accuse. They simply rewound the film and played it again. In the weeks that followed, the English lessons continued, but they felt different now. The word freedom still hung on the board, but it no longer sounded like a trick. It sounded like a question. Some women refused to return to the lessons. Others came early. Sabine found herself mouthing English words to the rhythm of her own breath, her tongue growing more flexible with each passing day. One morning, she looked at the chalkboard and whispered, "Home," just loud enough to hear it. Not Germany, not America, something else. Something not yet found. That night she added a new line to her journal. "I saw the truth today. It was not in a uniform. It was in the eyes of the dying. I don't know who I am anymore." Then she closed the book, pulled her blanket tight, and lay in the dark, unable to sleep. The projector's flicker still danced behind her eyelids, and the word freedom, that too, would not go away. It was nearly spring when the gates opened. Not forever, just wide enough to let a truck through. The guards read off a list of names: Sabine, Ilse, Lotte, a few others. They were told to dress, to bring nothing but their issued work clothes. No one explained where they were going. The women climbed into the back of the truck with stiff bodies and racing thoughts. Outside the fence the world had turned green again. Wildflowers sprouted along the ditches. A breeze carried the scent of cut grass and something sweeter. Baked bread, maybe. Civilization. They rode in silence, watching the American countryside roll past like a dream drawn in color. Fields unscarred by shellfire, roads unbroken by tank treads. And then, after less than an hour, the truck slowed. A church steeple came into view. Then a row of clapboard houses with white picket fences. Children ran along the sidewalk. Women swept porches. A dog barked. Nothing burned, nothing screamed. They were led to a red brick building with arched windows and a garden blooming with hydrangeas. Inside, folding tables were set with trays. American women, volunteers, they were told, smiled and pointed to chairs. "Sit, sit," one said, placing a slice of pie on each plate. Sabine stared down at hers, peach, golden and glistening, warm enough to melt the crust. A fork lay neatly beside it. No one moved. The smell alone made Lotte's eyes water. The American woman who had served her noticed and tilted her head gently. "Go ahead," she said. "Eat." No one understood the words, but they understood the kindness. Sabine took the first bite, and something in her stomach clenched. It was too rich, too soft. It reminded her of her mother's baking before the war. She had not tasted fruit this sweet since she was a girl. Ilse leaned forward slowly, her fork trembling. "This isn't real," she whispered. "It can't be." But it was. They were fed, not as prisoners, but as workers. Afterwards they were led to the town square, handed gloves, and assigned to simple tasks: cleaning park benches, clearing flower beds, sorting supplies in the church pantry. The townspeople watched with cautious curiosity. Some kept their distance, others nodded politely. No one shouted. No one threw stones. Sabine could not make sense of it. But the real wound came in glimpses, those moments when the veil lifted and comparison struck like lightning. Children walked home from school with lunchboxes swinging from their hands, their cheeks round, their laughter bright. They skipped. They chased butterflies. They looked nothing like the hollow-eyed street orphans of Leipzig and Berlin, the ones who fought over coal crumbs in alleyways. Sabine thought of her nephew, if he was still alive, how he used to hide potatoes in his shoes to make them last longer. Here, children dropped sandwiches on the ground and walked away without looking back. The women did not speak much on the ride back. The air inside the truck was heavy, not with heat, but with recognition. It had taken only one day to see what they hadn't dared admit inside the fence. America had not only survived the war, it had thrived. And they, who had once believed themselves part of a superior order, were now the beggars on the edge of someone else's Eden. That night, as the gates closed behind them, Lotta sat on her bunk without touching her supper. Ilse paced. Sabine stared at the ceiling and said, flatly, "We will have to return." The others didn't answer, but the truth of it settled over the barracks like fog. The war was over. But home was a country of ashes and broken faces, and now they had seen a world where the air was clean, the bread was soft, and kindness was served with a slice of pie. It wasn't just the return they feared, it was what they would carry back with them, and what that would cost. The orders came at dawn, the sound of boots outside the barracks, followed by a voice that spoke without emotion. Prepare for transport. For a moment, no one moved. Then the realization spread like a slow fever. They were going home. Home, a word that once promised warmth, now carried the chill of uncertainty. The women packed in silence, folding what little they owned. A few pressed the camp-issued blankets to their faces, breathing in the faint scent of soap, as if trying to memorize it. Others slipped the paper money from the canteen into their shoes, though it would mean nothing beyond the fence. By the time the trucks rolled toward the coast, the camp looked strangely hollow, as though part of their souls had been left behind with the dust. The journey east felt like traveling backward through time. In America, the air had been full of life and color. In the ports of Europe, everything seemed gray. The ships creaked under the weight of soldiers and prisoners alike, the Atlantic wind biting through the thin coats they had once thought sufficient. They huddled together on the deck as waves slapped the hull, staring toward a horizon that led not to comfort, but to reckoning. Sabine thought of the pies, the gardens, the music on the radio. She tried to summon anger for her captors and failed. In its place was something worse. Longing. When they reached Germany, there were no flags, no brass bands, no embraces, only silence and smoke. The train stations were half broken, the roofs collapsed, and the air smelled of ash and coal. They stepped off the wagons into cities they barely recognized. Buildings stood like cracked teeth against a sky too pale to be called blue. Rubble lined every street, and between the ruins people moved like ghosts, eyes hollow, faces turned inward. Children with bare feet sifted through debris, searching for anything that could burn. One of them, no older than 7, stared at the women in American coats and muttered something under his breath. Traitors, perhaps, or survivors. It was hard to tell. Lotta's home in Hamburg was gone, reduced to a shell of scorched bricks. Her sister Marta met her at what used to be their doorway, thin as a shadow, her hair cropped close to her scalp. "You came back?" she said, but her voice held no joy. Over tea made from dried weeds, Marta asked the question that had already been whispered by others. "What did you give them?" Lotta blinked, confused. The Americans. "You said they fed you, clothed you. What did you give them in return?" It wasn't anger in her tone, but disbelief, a quiet accusation that kindness must have a price. Lotta wanted to say nothing, that the Cowboys had offered blankets and food with no demand except that they live. But the words caught in her throat. The truth sounded too strange, too fragile to survive this place of ruin. Everywhere they went, the women were met with the same stares, curiosity mixed with contempt. They were not heroes returning from captivity. They were questions no one wanted to ask aloud. They had seen something the others hadn't, something that didn't fit inside the story Germany told itself to keep breathing. Sabine found her mother living in a cellar, her hands mottled and trembling. When Sabine told her she had worked in a camp kitchen in Louisiana and been given coffee each morning, her mother's eyes clouded. "Don't speak of that," she whispered. "People will think you liked it." But silence brought no peace. Each night, Sabine dreamed of the camp's open sky, of the cowboys' slow drawls, of music carried on warm wind. In the daylight, she walked through streets where hunger gnawed at every doorway and thought of the shelves in the American canteen, chocolate bars lined like soldiers, untouched by war. Shame followed her like a second shadow. She had survived, yes, but she had learned something no one wanted to hear, that the enemy's mercy had been more human than her nation's pride. In time, she stopped trying to explain. When people asked what it was like in America, she would only say, "Different." But at night, when she lay beneath a patched quilt in the ruins of her home, she pressed her palms together and remembered the first blanket handed to her by a man in a Stetson hat. And in that memory, she found the cruelest truth of all, that going home was not freedom. It was another kind of captivity, one built not from barbed wire, but from silence. The storm came sudden and heavy, the kind that rolled over the hills with no warning, turning the sky to slate and the streets to glass. Inside a small cottage on the edge of a Bavarian village, an older woman moved quickly through the darkened room. Her hands, still firm despite the years, reached for the window latches, pulling them shut against the wind. Thunder cracked in the distance. In the corner, a little girl whimpered from under her blanket. "Mama," she whispered. "Mama, I'm cold." The woman crossed the room, opened the wooden chest at the foot of her bed, and pulled it out. The fabric was thin now, the color long since faded from olive drab to a soft, ambiguous gray. There were patches in the corners, a frayed seam at the edge, but it was clean, folded with care, and held a weight no one else in the house could feel. She knelt beside her daughter and tucked the blanket around her gently, smoothing it over the girl's small shoulders. Then she sat back, her hand lingering for a moment, and watched the child settle into sleep. That blanket, American-issue military wool, had once been handed to her on the day she arrived at a camp she thought would kill her. It had smelled like dust and sun. It had been too big for her then, a thing that didn't belong on her shoulders. But it had wrapped around her anyway. She had clung to it like a second skin in the months that followed, pulling it tighter on the nights when the questions came. Now, all these years later, she still kept it. Not because it was warm, but because it was the first thing in her life that said, "You are allowed to live." Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, memories returned like echoes. The scent of black coffee in a mess hall, the sound of boots on dry gravel, the drawl of a southern voice saying, "Mornin', ma'am," as if she had always been someone worth naming. She remembered the shock of pie, the sting of hot water on her shoulders in the shower, the stillness in the room when the films played, and everything she thought she knew collapsed in silence. She never forgot the Cowboys, not because they were heroes, but because they were ordinary. They joked, they spat into the dirt, they wore hats too big, and walked with the ease of men who had never learned to fear their own country. They didn't touch her, they didn't shout. They gave her work, bread, language, and a blanket. Nothing more. And that was what undid her. She had never spoken of it publicly. When neighbors asked about her time during the war, she said she had been a prisoner, that it was difficult, that she had survived. But when she pulled the blanket from its chest, she told her daughter only this: "Someone gave me this when I had nothing." She didn't explain the politics, the shame, the impossible gratitude. She just wrapped the child in it and hoped that the fabric might still carry something of that long-ago kindness. Because her war had not ended at the gate. It had followed her, reshaped her, lived beneath her skin like a shadow. But something else had begun there, too, something she hadn't known how to name back then. Dignity, the kind you're not born with, but which is handed to you, one human gesture at a time. Before you go, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Where are you in the U.S.? Somewhere far from where this history unfolded. If this story moved you, please like the video and hit the subscribe button just below this player. It helps us bring more forgotten stories like this back to life. And if you tap the notification bell, you'll never miss the next archive we uncover. We can only keep making stories like this with your support. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the smallest acts, like a blanket handed to a shivering prisoner, can unravel an entire empire.